The winter of 2023 in Boston was the kind of cold that froze good judgment, which was why Arthur Sterling didn't think twice when his basement furnace started making a metallic, chewing sound. It was mid-December, and the affluent, quiet suburbs of Massachusetts were currently buried under a pristine, heavy blanket of white. Before that unsettling mechanical interruption, Arthur's morning had been defined by a quiet, deliberate sort of peace. At 51 years old, he was a man who found deep, genuine comfort in the simple rhythm of helping others without expecting anything in return. Just an hour earlier, he had been out in the biting frost, his breath pluming in the icy air as he rhythmically cleared the long, winding driveway of his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. The 80-year-old widow had stood shivering on her porch, wrapped tightly in a heavy wool shawl, insisting he take a crisp $20 bill for his trouble. Arthur had simply smiled, his eyes crinkling warmly behind his glasses, and gently pushed the money back into her trembling, gloved hand. He didn't shovel her snow for payment or praise, he did it because it was the right thing to do, firmly believing that a community only survives the harshness of winter if people genuinely look out for one another. Stepping back inside his own home, Arthur stamped the thick snow from his heavy boots and exhaled a long sigh of contentment. The Victorian house, which he had meticulously designed and personally renovated over the last 15 years, embraced him with immediate, enveloping warmth. The rich, earthy scent of dark roast coffee lingered heavily in the air, mixing perfectly with the nostalgic, buttery smooth voice of Frank Sinatra spinning softly on a vintage vinyl record player in the corner of the living room. Evelyn, his wife of 15 years, had been in Atlanta visiting a college friend for the past 3 days. Her temporary absence had left Arthur to enjoy a quiet, solitary weekend, a rare and deeply appreciated luxury for the busy architect. He loved his wife, naturally, but there was a specific, profound kind of tranquility in having the sprawling house entirely to himself, surrounded by his drafting tables, architectural blueprints, and the sturdy oak beams he had laid with his own 2 hands. He poured himself a fresh cup of steaming coffee, wrapping his large hands around the ceramic mug, and stood watching the snow gently fall against the frosted window panes. It was a picture-perfect morning, the kind of quiet weekend that made a man feel profoundly lucky. And then, the comfortable illusion shattered. The groan from the basement wasn't the usual comforting click and hum of a hard-working heating unit. It was a low, grinding noise, an ugly metallic chewing that vibrated intensely through the polished floorboards beneath Arthur's feet. Knowing from years of experience that losing heat in a Boston winter was a fast track to frozen pipes and a catastrophically flooded house, he immediately set his coffee down and called Briggs Heating and Cooling. Less than an hour later, a heavy-set HVAC technician named Marcus stood on Arthur's welcome mat, shaking the wet snow from his heavy work jacket. Marcus was a practical, direct man who smelled faintly of ozone, stale diner coffee, and motor oil. After a brief, polite exchange about the brutal weather and the treacherous road conditions, Arthur pointed him toward the basement stairs. "Take your time, Marcus. I'll be just upstairs in the kitchen if you need anything," Arthur said, his voice carrying that gentle, reassuring timbre that made people instinctively trust him. Leaving the technician to his diagnostic work, Arthur wandered into the bright, spacious kitchen to make himself an early lunch. He pulled leftover roasted turkey and a block of sharp cheddar from the refrigerator, meticulously assembling a sandwich on thick slices of artisan bread. He was just taking his first satisfying bite, enjoying the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint, distant sound of Marcus's heavy tools clinking downstairs, when his phone buzzed violently against the cold marble countertop. It was a text message from Marcus. Arthur wiped his hands carefully on a dish towel, picking up the device. The message was incredibly short, but the words seemed to rearrange themselves in his mind, stubbornly refusing to make immediate, logical sense. "Sir, there's a locked door behind your storage shelves. Who's inside?" Arthur blinked, staring hard at the illuminated screen. A locked door? Behind the storage shelves? That was physically impossible. As the architect who had literally drawn the blueprints and painstakingly overseen every single square inch of this home's renovation, Arthur knew the foundation like the back of his own hand. There was absolutely nothing behind those heavy, floor-to-ceiling industrial shelves where he kept his old architectural models and spare lumber. There was only supposed to be a solid, impenetrable concrete foundation wall. Leaving his sandwich completely forgotten on the counter, Arthur moved with a sudden, uncharacteristic urgency. He bypassed the living room, ignoring the cheerful crooning of the record player, and descended the wooden stairs into the damp, shadowy chill of the basement. Marcus was standing rigidly in the far corner of the room, his heavy-duty flashlight beam cutting sharply through the dim, dusty light. He had somehow managed to slide one of the massive wooden shelving units just a few feet away from the wall, something Arthur hadn't bothered to do in years. Arthur stepped up beside the nervous technician, the air suddenly catching and hitching in his throat. There, perfectly flush with the drywall and painted the exact same shade of slate gray to render it completely invisible in the shadows, was a heavy, hollow core door. It was a masterful, precise piece of carpentry, designed specifically and intentionally not to be seen by anyone who wasn't actively looking for it. But what made Arthur's blood run significantly colder than the unforgiving Boston winter outside wasn't the hidden door itself. It was the terrifying hardware attached to it. Securing the hidden door to the heavy, reinforced doorframe were 4 thick, heavy-duty metal padlocks, each attached to its own separate steel hasp. And from somewhere deep within that dark, concealed space, there was a sound. It was faint, perfectly rhythmic, and unmistakable in the quiet basement. Someone was breathing. Arthur stared at the heavy metal locks, his brilliant architectural mind racing, calculating, and finally coming to a devastating, terrifying realization. Locks on the outside of a door don't keep intruders out, they keep whatever's inside in. What a chilling discovery in the heart of a perfect home. If you are still watching this video and finding this mystery captivating, please drop a number 8 in the comments below to let me know you are right here with us. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss a single twist in Arthur's journey. Your amazing support is what helps us continue creating great content to entertain and inspire you. Now, let's find out exactly what is hiding behind that door. Let's continue. 3 police officers arrived within 8 minutes, their heavy winter boots tracking dirty snow across Arthur's pristine hardwood floors. The steady, mechanical sound of respiration echoing from the hidden space felt less like a sign of life and more like a countdown timer attached to the foundation of Arthur's peaceful existence. The situation was entirely surreal, a dark nightmare invading his brightly lit, meticulously designed home. Yet, Arthur stood calmly near the wooden staircase, watching the uniformed officers secure the perimeter. Despite the sheer absurdity and the rising terror blooming in his chest, his ingrained manners and fundamental decency held firm. He had even offered the freezing men freshly brewed hot coffee, a genuine gesture of hospitality that seemed to briefly disarm the heavy tension in the room. Detective Vance, however, had curtly declined the offer. Vance was a sharp, cynical investigator in his mid-40s, wearing a salt-stained overcoat and an exhausted expression that suggested he had seen the absolute worst of humanity and fully expected to see it again in this very house. Vance directed his men with sharp, concise hand gestures. The loud, grating snap of heavy bolt cutters biting through thick metal echoed violently through the damp basement. One by one, the 4 heavy-duty padlocks fell to the concrete floor with dull, heavy thuds. Vance signaled his closest officer, and with a swift, forceful kick, the concealed hollow core door swung wide open, revealing the dark void behind it. Arthur braced himself against the handrail, expecting the absolute worst. He prepared his mind for a gruesome discovery. But the small, windowless room was completely empty. There was no hostage bound to a chair. There was no victim. The space had been meticulously swept clean. The only objects sitting on the cold concrete floor were a small, black Bluetooth speaker, still warm to the touch and loudly looping the rhythmic breathing track, and a cheap burner phone resting precariously on an empty cardboard box. It was a sterile, highly calculated stage set, designed specifically to cause panic. Vance picked up the burner phone with a gloved hand, turning it over carefully before his sharp eyes flicked toward Arthur. The quiet architect met the detective's suspicious gaze with steady, honest confusion. There was nothing to hide because he knew nothing. Shortly after, they moved upstairs to the bright, sterile environment of the kitchen, leaving the dark, unsettling basement behind. Arthur sat at the granite kitchen island, his large hands neatly folded on the countertop, while Vance paced the length of the hardwood floor, his boots squeaking slightly against the polished wood. "Mr. Sterling," Vance began, his tone carefully neutral but heavily laden with professional skepticism. "Are you familiar with a storage facility located on Mercer Road?" It's about 5 miles from here, near the old industrial park. Arthur shook his head slowly, his brow furrowing in genuine bewilderment. No, detective. I've never been there. I have plenty of storage right here in my own home, as you just saw. That's highly interesting, Vance replied, flipping open a small, worn spiral notebook. Because according to their digital records, a climate-controlled unit was rented there exactly 3 weeks ago. It was paid for in cash, upfront for 6 months. The rental agreement bears your exact signature, and the emergency contact listed on the file is your personal cell phone number. Before Arthur could even begin to process the sheer, terrifying impossibility of that statement, the heavy oak front door of the house swung open. A flurry of freezing wind and swirling snow rushed into the foyer, followed immediately by Evelyn. She had supposedly driven back from Atlanta in record time, abandoning her trip the moment Arthur had called her to say the police were searching their home. Evelyn Sterling burst into the kitchen, her expensive designer wool coat dusted with fresh snow, her face a perfect, tragic mask of breathless panic. She rushed straight to Arthur, practically throwing herself at him, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck and burying her face in the shoulder of his sweater. Arthur! Oh my God, Arthur, what happened? Are you all right? They told me not to cross the tape outside, she cried, her voice trembling with what sounded exactly like profound, visceral terror. Arthur held her, his large, gentle hands rubbing her back soothingly to calm her down. She played the part of the horrified, fiercely supportive wife to absolute perfection. Every tear that spilled over her eyelashes, every ragged, shivering intake of breath, every protective squeeze of his arm was flawlessly executed. Yet, to an architect's eye, an eye rigorously trained for decades to notice microscopic misalignments, uneven surfaces, and structural flaws, there was something deeply unsettling about her performance. When she pulled back to look at him, the micro-expressions on her beautiful face reset just a fraction of a second too quickly. It was a mechanical, almost robotic precision completely hidden beneath a flawless veneer of marital devotion. Vance watched the emotional reunion with cold, assessing eyes, clearly unmoved by the display. He cleared his throat loudly, demanding their attention. Mrs. Sterling. I am glad you are here. I was just informing your husband about Unit 114 on Mercer Road. Evelyn pulled back slightly, her manicured hand still tightly gripping Arthur's. She looked at the detective with wide, innocent eyes. I don't understand. What does a storage unit have to do with someone breaking into our basement? We obtained a warrant and opened that unit an hour ago, Vance said, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with impending, inescapable consequence. Inside, we found women's clothing, personal effects, a diary, and a prepaid debit card linked to an account in your husband's name. They belong to a woman named Chloe Hayes. She is 32 years old, and she was reported missing from her apartment downtown exactly 11 days ago. The kitchen went completely, suffocatingly silent. The weight of the terrible accusation hung in the warm air, a thick, invisible noose suddenly tightening around Arthur's neck. He looked down at Evelyn, fully expecting her to gasp, to look at him in absolute shock, or to dissolve into confused, helpless tears. Instead, Evelyn's posture instantly stiffened. She immediately stepped slightly in front of Arthur, using her body to physically shield him from the detective's gaze. Her grip on his hand tightened to the point of actual physical pain. When she finally spoke, her voice was entirely stripped of its previous breathless panic, replaced by a chilling, unshakable composure that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Detective Vance, she said firmly, her eyes locking onto the seasoned cop without a single, solitary tremor of fear. Someone is clearly trying to set my husband up. This is an elaborate setup, plain and simple. My husband has never been to that facility, and he does not know this woman. Vance tilted his head, studying her intensely, noting the sudden, drastic shift in her demeanor. And how can you be so absolutely sure of that, Mrs. Sterling? She didn't tell the detective it was impossible for her husband to do such a thing, she simply said she knew him, a lawyer's answer dressed up in a wife's voice. Sleep is a luxury reserved for the innocent, and that night, Arthur Sterling found himself wide awake, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom he had shared with his wife for 15 years. The flawless, unwavering defense she had presented to the detective hours earlier played on an endless, agonizing loop in his exhausted mind. Under the bright, sterile lights of their kitchen, her performance had seemed like the fierce, protective loyalty of a loving spouse. But here, submerged in the heavy, suffocating darkness of the midnight hour, listening to the perfectly steady rhythm of her breathing just inches away, that absolute certainty felt deeply, profoundly sinister. Arthur carefully slid out from beneath the heavy down comforter, his bare feet making absolutely no sound against the thick carpet. Driven by an instinct he couldn't fully articulate, he moved quietly toward Evelyn's side of the bed. Resting on her polished mahogany nightstand was her favorite book, a worn, dog-eared paperback copy of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. She read it every winter, claiming she admired the methodical structure of the prose. He picked the book up, feeling its familiar weight. As he gently thumbed through the pages, a small, stiff piece of paper slipped out from the back cover, fluttering silently to the floor. Arthur bent down, picking it up. He stepped softly into the ensuite bathroom, clicking on the dim vanity nightlight. It was a printed photograph. Staring back at him, frozen in a candid, happy moment, was a young woman with dark hair. It was Chloe Hayes. The missing woman. Evelyn had hidden the very face of the alleged victim in plain sight, tucked away inside a novel about a calculated murder. A normal man might have screamed, thrown the book against the mirror, or shaken his wife awake to demand the horrifying truth. But Arthur was an architect. When he found a fatal crack in a foundation, he didn't scream at the concrete, he immediately began calculating how the entire structure was going to collapse. He returned the photo to the book, placed the novel exactly where he had found it, and sat in a leather armchair by the window until the sun finally breached the freezing Boston skyline. By 8 o'clock that morning, the city was awake, and Arthur was sitting in a worn, red vinyl booth at a classic, neon-lit local diner. The comforting, deeply American aroma of sizzling bacon, freshly poured dark roast coffee, and cheap maple syrup hung thick in the warm air, a stark contrast to the snow-covered streets outside. The diner was a neighborhood staple, the kind of place where the jukebox still worked and the staff called you honey. Sitting across from him was Julian, his oldest college friend and a highly sought-after insurance fraud investigator. Julian was a man who spent his entire professional life dissecting the elaborate lies people told for money. A young, visibly exhausted waitress hurried over to their booth, balancing a heavy tray. Her name tag read Sarah, and the dark circles under her eyes spoke of double shifts and unspoken struggles. She accidentally spilled a few drops of hot coffee onto the formica table, immediately apologizing with a terrified, frantic stammer. "It's perfectly fine, Sarah." "Really, don't worry about it at all," Arthur said, his voice a soothing, gentle rumble. As she rushed off to fetch a damp rag, Arthur casually pulled a crisp $20 bill from his wallet and slipped it under his coffee saucer. Even as his own meticulously built life was violently burning to the ground, his core decency remained entirely untouched. He firmly believed that a man's character was defined by how he treated people when he had absolutely nothing to gain. Julian watched the quiet exchange, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "You're too good for this world, Artie. Now, tell me what's going on." For the next 20 minutes, Arthur laid out the nightmare in a low voice. The hidden room, the burner phone, the storage unit, and finally, the photograph hidden inside the true crime novel. Julian listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker by the second. "We need to look at the money," Julian finally said, his tone deadly serious. "Liars always leave a financial fingerprint. We need every joint bank statement you have. Go back at least 7 years." An hour later, they were locked inside Julian's secure downtown office, surrounded by stacks of printed financial records. Arthur had always trusted Evelyn to manage the household budget. It was a mundane task she had eagerly volunteered for early in their marriage. As Julian's highly trained eyes scanned the columns of numbers, the terrifying brilliance of Evelyn's plans slowly came into sharp, horrifying focus. There were no massive withdrawals. There were no sudden, dramatic transfers to offshore accounts that would trigger a bank's security algorithm. Instead, it was a masterpiece of microscopic, methodical theft. A recurring subscription fee to a shell company here. An unnecessary insurance premium there. Small, Seemingly innocuous cash withdrawals made every third month, always kept just under the threshold that would require a paper trail. Julian tallied the hidden hemorrhage using a red marker, circling the tiny anomalies one by one until the page looked like it was bleeding. Over the course of 7 years, Evelyn had quietly siphoned off just over $60,000. It was a massive war chest, moved so silently that Arthur had never heard a single sound or suspected a single thing. But the true climax of their agonizing search wasn't the total amount stolen. It was the date of the very first irregular transaction. Julian pointed his pen at a faded bank statement from over a decade ago, looking up at his friend with deep sorrow. Evelyn hadn't started stealing because they hit a rough patch, or because she fell out of love. She had initiated the fraudulent transfers exactly 14 months after their wedding day. While Arthur had been happily picking out paint colors for their first home and building a life for them, she had already started preparing his cage. Evelyn hadn't just studied him for 15 years, she had become completely fluent in his habits, turning his predictable, quiet life into the perfect weapon against him. Arthur Sterling was not a vengeful man by nature, but he was an extremely patient one, and patience, it turned out, was the only currency that mattered in a long game. The horrifying discovery of the $60,000 missing over the past 7 years wasn't just the revelation of stolen money, it was the foundational blueprint of a meticulously designed trap he was currently standing in, and it was finally time to dismantle it. The following Saturday was a crisp, freezing weekend in Boston, the kind of bright winter day that made the snow-covered neighborhood look like a classic holiday postcard. Arthur drove his sturdy, well-maintained older SUV to the local neighborhood hardware store. The familiar smell of cut lumber, motor oil, and dry salt greeted him as he walked through the automatic sliding doors. Before attending to his own urgent mission, Arthur noticed an older gentleman struggling in the parking lot, attempting to heave a heavy, 50-pound bag of driveway salt into the trunk of a Buick. Without a second thought, Arthur altered his path. "Let me give you a hand with that, sir," Arthur offered, his voice carrying its usual warm, gentle rumble. He easily lifted the heavy bags, arranging them neatly in the trunk. The elderly man thanked him profusely, clearly touched by the random act of kindness. Arthur simply smiled, wishing him a warm and safe weekend before turning back toward the far end of the parking lot. Even with his entire life hanging in the balance, Arthur refused to let the darkness of his situation extinguish his innate decency. Waiting for him near the back of the store, leaning against a rusted pickup truck, was his older brother, Richard. A retired Marine with a sharply lined face and a posture that still commanded absolute authority, Richard was a man of extreme precision. Arthur had explained the nightmare to him the night before. True to his military background, Richard hadn't panicked, gasped, or offered empty sympathies. He simply nodded and formulated a tactical response. Together, the two brothers walked into the electronics aisle. They selected a highly sensitive, discreet wireless audio monitor, the kind usually meant for nursery rooms but powerful enough to pick up a whisper across a wide space. When they reached the register, Richard firmly pushed Arthur's hand away and paid for the device entirely in cash. No digital footprint. No paper trail. Returning to his sprawling Victorian home an hour later, Arthur found the house empty. Evelyn had gone out to run some weekend errands. He immediately walked into the sunroom. It was Evelyn's favorite space, a bright, glass-enclosed addition filled with expensive potted plants, smelling faintly of lavender and damp potting soil. It was here that she took all of her private phone calls. Moving with the quiet, deliberate care of an architect adjusting a delicate model, Arthur tucked the tiny audio transmitter deep behind the thick, sweeping fronds of a large potted fern resting on the windowsill. He knew for a fact the plant hadn't been moved in years. When Evelyn returned home, Arthur played his part with devastating perfection. He slumped his broad shoulders, rubbed his tired eyes, and allowed his voice to crack just slightly when he spoke. He presented her with the exact image she needed to see, a broken, terrified husband, entirely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of a police investigation he couldn't comprehend. Evelyn held him, stroking his hair and murmuring sweet, comforting reassurances, entirely oblivious to the quiet storm gathering behind his eyes. Days later, Evelyn's closest friend, Renee, arrived from Cincinnati for a pre-planned visit. The two women settled into the sunroom with steaming mugs of herbal tea. Seizing the opportunity, Arthur politely excused himself, telling his wife he needed some fresh air and a long drive to clear his suffocating thoughts. Evelyn kissed his cheek sympathetically, urging him to take all the time he needed. Arthur put on his heavy winter coat, walked out into the freezing afternoon, and climbed into his SUV. But he didn't leave the neighborhood. He drove exactly 4 blocks down the quiet, snow-lined street, pulling over beneath the shadow of a large, dormant oak tree. He left the engine idling, the heater humming a low, steady note against the biting cold outside. With a remarkably steady hand, he reached into his glove compartment and turned on the audio receiver. At first, the earpiece delivered only the harmless sounds of old friends catching up, small talk about holiday shopping, mutual acquaintances, and the bitter cold. Arthur sat perfectly still in the dark cabin of his car, his breath misting slightly in the air. And then, the tone in the sunroom abruptly shifted. Through the earpiece, Arthur heard his wife's voice drop its warm, comforting pitch. The faux concern completely vanished, replaced by something metallic, cold, and horrifyingly precise. "He has absolutely no idea," Evelyn said, her voice echoing chillingly in Arthur's dark car. Renee sounded slightly nervous, her voice trembling as she asked if Arthur suspected anything about the missing woman, Chloe. Evelyn laughed. It wasn't a nervous chuckle, it was a relaxed, genuinely amused sound of pure triumph that made the blood freeze in Arthur's veins. "Please, Renee. Arthur is too busy playing the martyr. And Chloe is perfectly safe in Phoenix. I paid her more than enough cash to stay entirely off the grid for 60 days. By the time the police put the pieces together, Arthur will already be taking the fall for everything." Sitting in the freezing dark of his car, listening to his wife laugh about the architecture of his destruction, the last trace of the naive man Arthur used to be quietly died. Finding a ghost is remarkably easy if you know exactly how much they were paid to disappear. The audio recording from the sunroom had been a goldmine of catastrophic arrogance. By casually mentioning the city of Phoenix to her friend, Evelyn had unwittingly handed her husband the exact coordinates he needed to strike the final, lethal blow to her masterpiece. Arthur wasted no time. The very next morning, he sat across from Carl Upton, a retired Boston Police Department investigator who now operated privately. Carl was the kind of man whose entire personality resembled a locked filing cabinet, discreet, utterly unshakable, and highly efficient. Arthur handed Carl a thick manila envelope containing the cash he had gathered to fund the search and the single photograph of Chloe Hayes he had found hidden inside Evelyn's true crime novel. "Find her," Arthur instructed, his voice low and steady over their black coffees. "But Carl, I want to be entirely clear about how you handle this. Do not intimidate her. Do not treat her like a hardened criminal. My wife manipulated her. She is likely just a desperate young woman who needed money and made a terrible, blind choice without understanding the gravity of what she was stepping into." Even with his freedom and reputation hanging by a fraying thread, Arthur refused to let bitterness cloud his judgment. He knew firsthand the danger of judging someone solely on the surface. It took Carl exactly 4 days to locate the missing woman. The scene shifted drastically from the freezing, snow-covered streets of Massachusetts to a dry, sun-bleached mid-range hotel lobby on Camelback Road in Phoenix, Arizona. Carl approached Chloe Hayes as she sat nervously by a dusty decorative fountain. She was not the mastermind the police back in Boston believed her to be. When Carl sat across from her, quietly placing his private investigator credentials on the glass table and gently explaining the legal definition of criminal conspiracy, her fragile facade instantly crumbled. She didn't lawyer up or try to run. Instead, she wept quietly into her hands. As Arthur had correctly deduced, she was simply a pawn who had been paid a substantial sum to stay entirely off the grid for 60 days. With Carl's patient, surprisingly gentle guidance, she provided a full, detailed, and notarized confession outlining exactly how Evelyn had orchestrated the entire disappearance. Before leaving, Carl took one clear, high-resolution photograph of Chloe standing in the blinding Arizona sun, holding up that morning's local newspaper. By Friday evening, the undeniable proof had been securely transmitted back to Boston. A heavy, tense silence blanketed the Sterling household. Outside, the winter sky had darkened into a deep, bruised purple. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. Evelyn was relaxing in her beloved sunroom, comfortably curled up on a plush wicker sofa with her reading glasses perched perfectly on the bridge of her nose. She looked like the very picture of domestic tranquility, a devoted wife patiently weathering a terrible storm. Arthur sat alone at the large granite island in the kitchen, bathed in the soft, yellow glow of the overhead pendant lights. His laptop was open before him. Using a secure, entirely untraceable email address that Julian had helped him set up specifically for this moment, Arthur composed a blank message directed to his wife's personal phone. He attached 2 carefully selected files. The first was the crisp audio recording of her boasting to Renee about his impending imprisonment. The second was the photograph Carl had taken just hours earlier, the missing woman, Chloe Hayes, very much alive and holding today's Phoenix Gazette. Arthur did not write a subject line. He did not include a message of anger or triumph. He simply pressed send, closed the laptop with a soft click, and walked silently into the darkened hallway that connected the kitchen to the sunroom. He stood perfectly still in the deep shadows, watching through the glass double doors. It took less than a minute. A soft, cheerful ping echoed from Evelyn's phone resting on the glass coffee table. She reached for it casually, her eyes still mostly focused on her book. She tapped the screen. Arthur watched as the color rapidly drained from his wife's beautiful face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. Her constant, calculating physical motion, the slight shifting of her legs, the casual flipping of a page, the gentle tapping of her manicured fingers, completely stopped. It was as if someone had abruptly pulled the power cord on a complex machine. She stared at the screen, her mouth parting in sheer, unadulterated terror as the audio file played softly in the quiet room, her own arrogant laughter echoing back at her alongside the undeniable photographic proof of her failure. Her perfect, 7-year plan had just collapsed into dust in the span of 3 seconds. She slowly rose from the sofa, her hands trembling violently, looking wildly around the empty room as the realization of her absolute defeat crashed down upon her. She stood in the doorway like a woman who had just heard a sound she couldn't locate, entirely unaware that the architect of her downfall was watching her breathe. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a house when a lie finally runs out of oxygen. Arthur Sterling woke up to exactly that silence on a crisp, clear Tuesday morning. The relentless snowstorm that had buried Boston over the past week had finally broken overnight, leaving behind a brilliantly bright, cloudless winter sky. The blinding morning sunlight reflecting off the pristine snowbanks felt like a physical manifestation of clarity and undeniable truth. Arthur dressed methodically, pulling on a heavy wool sweater and his tailored winter coat. He moved quietly through the expansive house, leaving Evelyn upstairs. She had spent the entire weekend locked in a state of catatonic shock after opening his anonymous email, wandering the halls like a ghost waiting for the inevitable executioner. Arthur didn't gloat, nor did he offer false comforts. He simply let her sit in the suffocating ruins of her own creation. Evelyn had spent 7 years meticulously building a prison for her husband, but Arthur had just built hers in under 3 weeks. Stepping out into the biting cold, Arthur started his SUV and began the slow, careful drive downtown. The roads were mostly plowed, the city slowly returning to its bustling life. A few blocks from the police precinct, he pulled over near a familiar bus stop. Huddled on the freezing bench, wrapped tightly in a tattered sleeping bag, was an older homeless man Arthur recognized from his daily commutes. Leaving the engine running, Arthur walked into a nearby corner bakery and emerged a few minutes later carrying a steaming large coffee and 2 warm, heavily buttered muffins. He crossed the icy sidewalk and gently handed the brown paper bag and the hot cup to the shivering man. Arthur didn't ask for a thank you, nor did he linger to make a grand display of his charity. He offered a simple, warm smile, told the man to stay safe in the bitter cold, and walked back to his car. It was the hardest day of his life, the day his marriage officially ended in betrayal and ruin, yet Arthur absolutely refused to let Evelyn's darkness extinguish his fundamental humanity. 10 minutes later, Arthur walked through the heavy glass doors of the Boston Police Department. The precinct was chaotic, smelling of stale coffee and damp wool, but Arthur moved with quiet, unshakable purpose. He asked the desk sergeant for Detective Vance. When he was finally escorted back to the detective's cluttered desk, Vance looked up, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of deep suspicion and professional fatigue. He likely expected a tearful confession or a desperate plea deal. Instead, Arthur calmly unbuttoned his coat, took a seat, and placed a pristine, thickly padded navy blue folder onto the center of the scratched metal desk. "Good morning, Detective," Arthur said, his voice a steady, grounding rumble. "I believe you will find everything you need in there regarding the disappearance of Chloe Hayes." Vance frowned heavily, slowly opening the metal clasp of the folder. For the next 20 minutes, the cynical, hardened detective read through the perfectly organized documents in absolute, stunned silence. He reviewed the 7 years of highlighted financial statements charting Evelyn's methodical theft. He examined the high-resolution photographs of a very much alive Chloe Hayes holding a current newspaper in the Arizona Sun. He read the notarized, signed confession detailing the bribery and the elaborate frame-up. Finally, Vance plugged in the small flash drive Arthur had provided, slipping on a pair of headphones to listen to the crystal-clear audio recording of Evelyn boasting to her friend from the comfort of her sunroom. When Vance finally pulled the headphones off, the atmosphere around the desk had completely transformed. The suspicion in the detective's eyes had vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, unmistakable respect. Vance looked at the quiet architect sitting across from him, realizing he had wildly underestimated the man. Arthur hadn't panicked or run, he had built an airtight, irrefutable defense while standing directly inside the fire. At exactly 9 o'clock that morning, 3 police cruisers pulled silently into the driveway of the Sterling residence, their red and blue lights flashing rhythmically against the pristine white snow. Arthur stood quietly on the sidewalk, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, the icy wind biting at his cheeks. The heavy oak door of his home swung open, and Evelyn was escorted out by 2 uniformed officers. She was not wearing her expensive designer coat, the freezing air hit her sharply as the cold steel handcuffs were locked securely around her wrists. She was formally under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The neighborhood was dead quiet, save for the crunching of boots on the snow. As the officers guided her toward the back of the waiting patrol car, Evelyn suddenly stopped. She turned her head, her frantic, terrified eyes locking onto Arthur. She stared at him, desperately searching his familiar face for any trace of the soft, pliable, unconditionally forgiving husband she thought she had manipulated so easily. She looked for the naive man who would bail her out, who would take the blame, who would crumble under the weight of her deceit. But that man wasn't there. In his place stood a strong, composed survivor who had outsmarted her at every single turn without ever raising his voice. Arthur didn't smile maliciously, nor did he offer a triumphant sneer. He simply met her panicked gaze and gave her a single, incredibly calm nod. It was the final, devastating checkmate. She knew his signature, his habits, and his schedule, but as the patrol car drove away into the winter morning, she realized she never knew his spine. Arthur's journey reminds us that the quietest souls often carry the strongest resolve, weathering the harshest storms of betrayal not with vengeance, but with unwavering grace. True strength isn't always loud. As we learn from his story, the depth of a person's character should never be judged merely by their gentle exterior. When we choose kindness over cruelty, even in our darkest moments, we build an unshakable foundation that no deceit can ever destroy. If Arthur's resilient spirit touched your heart today, we invite you to share this warmth with someone you love, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. To continue exploring the profound, unexpected depths of the human heart with us, please consider subscribing to Shocking Love Story New, because the most powerful stories are the ones we experience together.